All right, we're going to move on to change up here a little bit, but we've got North Carolina's Clean Energy Director on hold for us, and she's been waiting a few minutes. So I want to go ahead and have her talk about Executive Order 246. And some of you heard me mention earlier about the need for an equitable permitting, air permitting program in the state. And the governor announced Executive Order 246 in January, and in that, they refer to cumulative impacts of air pollution, health disparities, and other language that makes me hopeful that we can work with them to move those move those ideals forward. So I'm going to introduce Dion, and she's going to share with us a little bit more about Executive Order 245. Dion is the Clean Energy Director for the state of North Carolina, where she oversees the governor's energy and environmental policies. She was instrumental at shepherding the state's recent clean energy legislation, House Bill 951, across the finish line in the General Assembly. She's currently overseeing the state's efforts to mitigate climate change and transition to clean energy, to address environmental justice, and to create a more equitable and sustainable economy for North Carolina. Prior to her role as the Clean Energy Director, Dion was interim secretary at our Department of Environmental Quality. Before her roles in public service for North Carolina, she served at the Environmental Defense Fund as the Director of Southeast Climate and Energy, following 6 years at the Atlanta EPA Regional Office as Congressional and Governmental Liaison. Additional environmental experience includes government service at the Ohio EPA and the City of Dallas, as well as an environmental specialist at Turner Colley Braden. She's an Air Force veteran. She holds a BA from Wright State in environmental geology and a Master of Science from the University of North Texas in environmental science. We are so fortunate to hear from Dion today about Executive Order 246. Please welcome her.
Hi, everyone. I'm so sorry I couldn't be there in person with you. And I just want to make one little edit to my bio. Often what falls off is I'm also a community college graduate. I have an associate's degree in environmental geology from Sinclair Community College in Dayton, Ohio. And I think that's really important to highlight, especially with some of the things we're going to talk about today and some of the initiatives that Governor Cooper is putting into place. So as June mentioned, and thank you, June, for inviting me. And again, I wish I could be there in person. Unfortunately, I've got a commitment here in Raleigh later. But I'm super excited to talk about Executive Order 246, and I am also hopeful. I am hopeful that we are on a path towards a clean, equitable economy. And as you all know, and as June mentioned, in the fall of last year, we passed a bipartisan climate law here in the state. That climate law specifically targets the power sector, investor-owned utilities. We have a statute now that requires a 70% reduction by 2030 in the power sector and achieving net zero by 2050 in the power sector. And I think that's really important because as we look to decarbonize other areas, the power sector is going to be foundational. But I think what some of the things we heard were some of the priorities. It is a bipartisan compromise bill. So, the governor and I did not get everything we wanted in this bill, but we made firm commitments to continue to focus on equity and affordability and find the places outside of the bill that we could continue to seek opportunities in those spaces. And there is an affordability docket at the Utilities Commission that several stakeholders are working on. And then this executive order is also a complement to that legislation. And it's a complement in a number of ways. It's a complement in that it starts to change our focus from what has been primarily on the power sector for a while, not solely on the power sector, but primarily. And it also expands and emphasizes the importance of environmental justice and equity in our transition to a clean economy. So on January 7th in 2022, Governor Cooper issued Executive Order 246. There was a ceremony at NCANT, and I unfortunately had COVID at the time, so I wasn't able to participate, but my understanding was it was a fantastic ceremony. I did watch it, we live streamed it. But I want to highlight a few things about this as we get into the executive order, and specifically some of the environmental justice provisions that June and Joel asked me to highlight. But I also want to talk about some of the other areas and how it complements. So as some of you may know, the governor sort of leaned in on climate initially with Executive Order 80 that was signed back in 2018. And what Executive Order 80 did was it set some economy-wide goals. One of the primary things that 246 does is updates those economy-wide goals. And then it also starts to transition our focus from the power sector, which Executive Order 80 required both a clean energy plan and a zero emission vehicle plan. The clean energy plan was arguably a broader stakeholder process that resulted in a more robust plan. Not to say that the zero emission vehicle plan doesn't have value, it certainly does, but I think it was a first iteration of where we hope to go. The clean energy plan, however, was much more comprehensive. It laid out some goals, it laid out some workforce goals, some equity goals, some scientific goals, and some policy goals. So with that, after the clean energy plan was initially developed, there was another year-long session of working groups. There were working groups that were looking at the utility model, how we incentivize our utility at the Utilities Commission, how they get paid and what they get paid for, basically. And we also looked at and how we could change that to incentivize things that we want them to focus on, like climate and clean energy and equity and affordability and some of those other things versus just blank slate lease cost. And then the other area that we focused on were what were some of the opportunities from a carbon perspective. How can we really focus on carbon? What are some of the policy pathways that are already in existence, or are there new pathways? And so another smaller set of stakeholders worked on that for about a year, started a dialogue that resulted in the legislation we just talked about, legislation that was bipartisan, that culminated last October in House Bill 951. So what Executive Order 246 does is it does a number of things. It's a very long executive order, but it starts to focus on broadening and complementing things like 951. It updates our economy-wide goals. So our economy-wide goals are now to get a 50% reduction in statewide greenhouse gas emissions by 2030 and achieve net zero emissions as soon as possible, but no later than 2050. But it also really starts to target in on transportation now that we have legislation in the power sector. It focuses on our transportation goals and increases those initial goals that we had to having a target of 1.25 million in zero emission vehicles registered in the state by 2030, and 50% of all new vehicle sales in the state being zero emission vehicles by 2030 as well. It also requires that the DEQ do a greenhouse gas inventory every 2 years. It required them to issue one in January of this year, which they did, which did demonstrate, as we expected, that transportation is now our number one climate emissions contributor in the state, which is the same as it is across the nation now. And I think focusing on that will be very valuable and important, because not only as we are focused on the climate emissions, we're going to tackle tailpipe emissions, which are they have such an impact in the local community and in such a vulnerable population, especially as we're talking about school buses and things like that. We talk about children with asthma, and those tailpipe emissions are real significant contributors. So I am glad that that's our new focus. It also laid out a requirement for a pathways analysis. And what the pathways analysis is going to do is going to look at each decade across all the sectors. What's it going to take to get us to those net zero goals? We're talking ag, we're talking industrial, transportation, power sector, everything. And then to complement the goals that we have in the transportation sector, it requires a clean transportation plan. That clean transportation plan stakeholder process kicked off last Friday. The governor spoke at that, and so that is underway, and we already have significant interest from the legislature on both sides of the aisle there. So I'm very hopeful that we'll move forward and hopefully have solid pathways, and hopefully legislative that supports and funds those pathways soon. But I think foremost, at least for me, was that we were able to tie environmental justice and equity into this. And the state has now made a commitment that we will look at environmental justice and are linking it to all of our future climate actions. So a few things that it talks about are the fact that we're going to put environmental justice leads in every cabinet agency. It also talks about public participation plans, stakeholder inputs, and considering environmental justice and equity when we do funding and things of that nature. And I'm going to go a little bit more specific into each of these, and also sort of let you know where we are on them, because we have been working on them and targeting them for about 4 months now, 3 months. First and foremost, it talks about in section 2 of the executive order that cabinet agencies shall incorporate environmental justice and equity considerations and benefits in the implementation of this executive order, as well as all of those other orders that have happened prior to this that focus on carbon. So that would be Executive Order 80, Executive Order 218, which sets offshore wind goals for the state, as well as looking at 951 and other things. Section 7 requires, like I mentioned, that every cabinet agency will have an environmental justice lead. And what the purpose and the point of this piece of the executive order is to demonstrate that environmental justice and equity considerations are not isolated to just the Department of Environmental Quality. There are actions that every agency takes that can affect the communities in our state. For instance, commerce, the types of businesses that we try and recruit and incentivize, being aware of the footprint that they will have, things of that nature. So every agency now does have an environmental justice lead. Those have been named. They are we worked with the environmental justice community, a number of leaders. Got a lot of input from them on sort of where those points of contact should live within the agencies. And there was a lot of concern as to if they would be high enough in the agency to really have any clout or make decisions. And so that was heard. And so most of the environmental justice leads are senior level managers. Some of them are actually even assistant secretaries. If you are interested in finding more information out about that, DEQ has a website for their environmental advisory board, and they have a list of all of these liaisons on that webpage now. The next section, section 8 of this executive order, requires that we have public participation plans in each of our agencies as well. So not all of the agencies have those to date. I know DEQ and a few others, I believe DOT have them, but we've had a consultant come in and did a survey and a number of interviews. They also did a search throughout the country for best management practices. So we have a model plan that we are going to be distributing to all of the environmental justice leads that have been named, as well as their communication counterparts in their agencies. That will be distributed to them here in the next week or two, and then those are required to be issued with stakeholder input in June, I believe, by June 1st. So we are trying to improve upon the ability for the community to engage, make things more transparent, make them systematic, and try and make sure that there is a two-way flow of communication, and that there is a focus on those that have been underserved. There's also specific targets for Indigenous people and people who may not have English as their first language. So all of that is in this executive order as well. And then there is one of the last sort of specific pieces, but there are a number of other areas where they impact environmental justice. But the last piece is a community input on environmental justice piece. So what that is intended to do, there will be a third-party facilitator that will come in and lead that. And that will be a dialogue between state agencies, your environmental justice leads that have been named, and the community to talk about where we can find solutions to challenges. You know, in some cases, there are legal barriers that we have not been able to overcome in certain circumstances. That does not mean that there are not other creative ways that we can tackle issues. There are priorities and things of that nature, and we want to have meaningful dialogue. And we want the state to be participating with the stakeholders, not us talking at you. So we are having a third-party facilitator so that we can have a more meaningfully engaged dialogue. So that is the piece I think, most excited about. And the outcomes of that effort are intended to be further executive actions that the governor or the state may be able to take on environmental justice, things like cumulative impacts in other areas that we just have not figured out solutions in a way that is robust enough yet. So where are we on all these things? Like I said, the environmental justice leads have been identified and named. The public participation plan is in draft and is going to be distributed in a training on that to those leads and our communications people. We are working to right now we have a number of contractors providing us with ideas and thoughts on what training for those environmental justice leads needs to look like. We want them to all be trained and have a baseline of knowledge on environmental justice, because it's not all across the board the same. So we want to ensure that there's at least a foundational level of knowledge about environmental justice as a whole, and then also specifically to environmental justice issues in the state before we do the third party facilitation. We are in the process also of getting proposals for what that third party facilitation and dialogue will look like. Also, I do know that there are a number of funders, at least two in the state, who are working to ensure that there are funds that they can issue as stipends so that community members can have a means to participate if financial means are a barrier. And so I know that I believe Z. Smith Reynolds and maybe Energy Foundation are looking at that, both from the perspective of this dialogue as well as the Clean Transportation Plan component of this executive order, which will also be about a year-long stakeholder process with periodic opportunities for engagement. And then the last few areas that I just want to touch on a little bit is this executive order talks about that state agencies, when they are going about funding and distributing grant dollars and things of that nature, they need to take into account both climate and equity when they start to deliver these funds. We've been talking with DEQ. They just did an assessment on some of the water grant funds that they've done, and they've exceeded some of the targets that they set for themselves. So this could have real beneficial implications for infrastructure bill money, for Volkswagen phase 2 money. I know there are specific carve outs and targets for, I believe, tier 1 counties in that Volkswagen money. There are some clean energy youth apprenticeship programs that are designated and required in this. Also, the Interagency Climate Council will be establishing a task force that looks at workforce diversity so that we can ensure that the opportunities that come, the jobs that come with this clean energy economy and manufacturing and other things that support it are available to all of our citizens and not just, you know, people who have moved to the triangle with advanced degrees. So, and then two other areas are, once the federal government issues their report on social cost of carbon, we will be putting together some guidance on how that can be integrated into agency decision making as well. And there is a requirement that DHHS will work to increase and improve understanding and awareness of health-related climate impacts. I think we focus a lot on some of the community, the environmental resiliency and infrastructure impacts, and don't always talk about the direct health impacts of climate change. So that was a lot. I know I am one of the final things between you all and getting the rest of your afternoon. So I don't want to be too long-winded. I am happy to answer any questions you might have. Thank you so much for letting me come and speak.
Thank you so much, Dion. Any questions about Executive Order 246 or comments? Yeah, Mercedes.
Hi there. Thank you so much, Dion. My ears really perked up when I heard about the clean energy apprenticeships that you just mentioned, and I just wonder, where can communities go to learn more about that, for opportunities for students or folks who might in the community who might be looking for something like that?
Yes, you know what, I will get that information to June to get out to the distribution list, because there are actually a couple of different things. There are some programs with Halifax County. There are some programs that will be directly focused on HBCUs, and then there are actually even some newer ones that are looking at wind energy in some of the northeastern community colleges and things of that nature. But they focus on various different components of the clean energy economy, including solar panel installation and work. I know Roanoke has, Roanoke Electric is one of our co-ops. They're fantastic. And they have committed to taking an apprentice from one of the early programs, but these programs were expanded in this executive order and somebody else leads that. But I will get that information to June and make sure we get it distributed to the list.
Anyone else? I know it's late afternoon, but we really wanted to get Dion here and have her talk about this important new development when it comes to climate health and equity. So thank you so much, Dion, and we really appreciate you being here and look forward to working with you.